Hi, and welcome to Out of My Mind. I'm Rob Wells. First thing out of the gate, I want to talk about what I posted yesterday, which was violence being associated with mental illness. And it turns that we were talking specifically about the Sutherland Springs shooting. It turns out today that the shooter is known to have been institutionalized for a time in 2012, and that he escaped from that institution. Um, the fact that the president called him out for being mentally ill yesterday, before that information was known, I am going to give him the benefit of the doubt that he had more information than I had. And so for this one time, I'm going to give Donald Trump a pass. But anyway, let's get on with today's episode. I thought about what I posted yesterday about violence and mental illness and how there are so many myths around that. And so I wanted to tackle another myth about mental illness. And this one is the myth that creative people tend to have mental illness, or on the flip side, that mentally ill people tend to be creative, more so than the neurotypical person. By the way, I use that term all the time, but I've never really defined it. Neurotypical means someone who does not have mental illness. It basically just means the average non-ill person, neurotypical. Um, but anyway, to dive right in, I'm going to start by quoting from Scientific American, um, and it says the romantic notion that mental illness and creativity are linked is so prominent in the public consciousness that it is rarely challenged. So before I continue, let me nip this in the bud. Mental illness is neither necessary nor sufficient for creativity. So, are people with mental illness more creative? Yes, we tend to kind of glamorize, romanticize mental illness, and we think about authors and artists who are brooding and melancholy, and we think of Emily Dickinson being an agoraphobe who let down her basket to the street so that people could deliver her food to eat because she would never leave. Um, and there's Vincent van Gogh, and there's Sylvia Plath. And on the other hand, you've got people like Jane Austen, or Milton, or uh, Chekhov, or Shakespeare, or Bach, who, by all accounts, were very neurotypical without these things, and yet they still managed to produce great art. So it obviously isn't a requirement that anyone needs to be mentally ill. And speaking as someone who is mentally ill and goes to a lot of conferences, one thing that I hear all the time, it makes me so mad, is when people say, I think we're all a little crazy, or I think we're all crazy to be in this position, in this role as a writer. No, it's a little infuriating to me. Um, so, anyway, in my personal experience, my creativity uh, has tanked since I became mentally ill and before I was on medicine. Some of you know, and I've talked about this elsewhere, I wrote my first big national novel variant in 11 days. And then that was the first draft, and it was an anomaly. I don't normally write that way. Even when I was not mentally ill, I didn't write that way. I was just very fortunate that things went really well. Um, but uh, my next book, Feedback, I was very sick. The mental illness had come on in between when I wrote Variant and when I wrote Feedback. And uh, Feedback took me 6 months to write 20,000 words. I was so sick. That is kind of the equivalent to a paragraph a day. And that was all that I was writing. So, in my personal circumstance, my mental illness absolutely didn't help my creativity. But let's see what science has to say. Quoting from Psychology Today, suffering is an intrinsic component of mental illness, but despite traditional romantic beliefs about creative people, such disruption seldom contributes directly to creative inspiration. So there was a study that was done in Sweden of the study took 40 years and 1.2 million people. So it's one of the vanguard studies, one of these lasting studies, generational studies. Um, and what they were correlating was people who were in creative occupations and I mean, they had a whole lot of other things that were part of this study, but they were able to determine this from it. People in creative occupations versus people who had mental illness. And what they found is that there was absolutely no correlation, no statistical correlation at all between creative position and mental illness, with one exception, uh, bipolar. Bipolar people were 8% more likely to be in a creative position than a neurotypical person, or an average Swede, I guess. Uh, so there was nothing. But what they did find out, which is my favorite part of this whole video today, they found out that people who are first degree relatives from someone with schizophrenia, bipolar, or anorexia, three of the things that they tracked. They didn't track a lot of the more detailed mental illnesses, but they tracked schizophrenia, bipolar, anorexia. First degree relatives of those people were extremely strongly represented uh, in creative job roles. What they suppose it might be, they're hypothesizing, but this is fascinating, that uh, there is a mentally ill person in the family, and then the first degree relatives, so your brother and sister, your parents, your children, um, uh, those people have a watered down type of mental illness. And they use this word, which I'm going to have to define a couple words. Okay, so let's get into this new word, schizotypy. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but that's what it is. Uh, Basically, what schizotypy is are four character traits that lead someone to be schizophrenic. And they looked at these schizotypy. Basically, what they are, I will define them all here. The first one is unusual experiences. Uh, so that's not really a something that happens to you. Well, it might be something that happens to you. It's not a illness. It is a thing that happens to you. So I guess we're right. It's a thing that happens to you. Next one is introverted anhedonia. Anhedonia is, as you would suppose, means the antithesis of hedonism, which is lavish, uh, wild, party, all those things. So someone who is an introverted adhedonist, anhedonist, uh, does not engage in those type of things. The next one is cognitive disorganization, which I think we can figure out what that means. And then the last one is impulse nonconformity. So having impulses that don't conform to the norm. Um, so they did testing, and they looked at people who were first degree siblings or first degree relatives of these people who had schizophrenia, bipolar, anorexia, and they said, do these people have these traits of schizotypy? And they found that the creative people um, have two of the positive traits, but they don't have the negative traits. They have uh, unusual experiences, which is considered a positive, and impulse nonconformity, which is someone who is going out and doing stuff and is thinking differently than normal people. If you only have those two things, unusual experiences and impulse nonconformity, then that leads to being a more creative person. So the idea then is that there is some degree of mental illness that is linking these first degree relatives to have these schizotypy uh, character traits. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. And it makes me say to my brother, who is also an author, and my sister, who is a playwright, uh, that you owe me because I'm the one who is bearing the brunt of your creativity. Um, anyway, one more study, and then we'll be done for today. Uh, they have done research into the brain, and the more a creative person is creative, the more they suppress the precuneus. Pardon me, I don't know my Latin, but it is a portion of the brain that controls something called the default mode network. And if you think about it, you can probably suss out the definition of default mode network. It basically means uh, when your brain is going into default mode, when it is uh, when it is just on autopilot. Uh, think about it when you're taking a shower, when you are gardening, when you are doing the dishes, when you are driving. So much of the time is spent kind of zoned out. And what they found in this study is that creative people, they imaged their brain and they looked at the precuneus, and they found that that precuneus in creative people is suppressed, and they are able. They don't go into default mode, and essentially what they do is daydream. Um, and I remember this is. I mean, I remember giving an interview once, and someone said, "What is the biggest change in being an author versus not being an author?" And I said, "I don't know what I used to think about before I was an author, because now whenever I'm have any free time, I'm thinking about my book, and I'm thinking about those characters and the plot and everything that's going on. Um, and I don't know what I used to do before then." And that is exactly what this study is getting to. Study is, by the way, by the Psychonomic Society. It was published in 2013, but I absolutely love it. So the takeaways from this are: my brother and sister owe me a lot, and that your relatives can owe to your creativity, and finally, that when you are daydreaming, you are suppressing your default mode network and becoming a more creative person. So, anyway, that is that. I will see you guys again maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day. But be on the lookout. Thanks so much for watching. If you like this, please click subscribe. And if you could, uh, maybe if you like this, spread it around. Tell your friends about it.